Oh, let's go. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the 10th Triennial Conference of the ACWR, Archivists for Congregations of Women Religious. I am Sister Mary Navarre, and I'm the Secretary for the ACWR and currently the Director of... Are we okay? Okay, I'm currently the Director for the Archives of the Dominican Sisters in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We have entitled this conference, Pioneers of the New Normal. The new part begins today with a new format for the conference. As you know, if you read your emails, we will meet every Thursday in September with live sessions of speakers, panels, and interesting presentations of various kinds. Each live session will be followed by a recorded version in our conference video gallery. Now, this capacity, along with the ability to reach members and guests from distant lands, is one of the advantages of this new and now nearly normal way of meeting by way of Zoom. If you look at your program guide, you'll get the details about all of this. So while we miss seeing you in your bodies, we are delighted to see you all via Zoom and to meet and greet both in the formal presentations and also in the more informal networking way, the first of which will follow our keynote this afternoon or morning if you are living in the West. Before I introduce our keynote, I'd like to remind all of us of the not so new rules of the road, tactfully called Zoom etiquette. You will be muted during presentations. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, use the chat feature or click on that raised hand option. If you do that, the raised hand option, be sure you remember to put that hand down when you're finished so the speaker doesn't think you have another question. And lastly, we love seeing your face. So would you kindly adjust your video camera and if possible, the lighting so we can see you and not just the top of your head or the side of your ear or the ceiling or the floor. So just look at your picture. If you can't see you, we can't either. And we can see you. Most of you, a few people have shut their video off, and that's okay too. But for those of us who are hearing impaired, it is enormously helpful to have the visual cues of the speaker's face. And one person just used the chat function to say that she has no video. So that's fine. We understand that too. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for the opening address of this conference. Margaret Susan Thompson is a professor of history at Syracuse University. She has published extensively on the history of women religious in the United States and has conducted research in over 4 dozen congregational archives around the country. I did the math, 4 times 12. Think of it, 48. Wow, she must know a lot about us. And she still likes us. I think that's very nice. She earned a bachelor's from Smith College, a master's and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and she's an associate of the IHM Sisters in Monroe, Michigan. And in my estimation, even more important than all of those degrees and publication is that she is a friend and an advocate for women's history and women religious in particular. She sees the worth in our stories. She recognizes the value in what each one of us does every day. And among her many publications, one of my favorites and one I highly recommend is an 18-lecture series on the history of women religious. It was published by Now You Know Media And we understand that company has been bought out by someone else, and we haven't quite figured out who that is yet, but we'll be happy to post that when we do. This series is an excellent and thoroughly researched and compellingly told tale of how we, who are women religious, got to where we are today, and by extension, how very important and crucial is the work of all archivists of women religious. So I am very eager to hear Dr. Thompson's thoughts as they are right now. And I ask you to join me in welcoming our friend and colleague, Margaret Susan Thompson, who says we can call her Peggy. So take it away, Peggy.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
I had the pleasure of visiting with and doing a little work with the Grand Rapids Dominican Sisters. And that was not an archive I researched, but it's an archive I visited since I did the research. So it's really an honor to be joining you today and to have a chance to speak with you and to talk with you. We're going to have plenty of time for question and answer at the end. And let me start sharing my screen. I hope you can see the PowerPoint. Mary, can you just nod?
Let me see. So yes, I think we can see it just fine. And people, if you want to get a full screen, you can kind of minimize the gallery, which right now I see 5 people on my gallery.
If you go to the top of the pictures of people, you can press either the straight line or the single box,
right?
And you will see fewer people.
And then you have a better screen to look at the PowerPoint.
And I'm hoping that you can see me once I start to talk, because right now I'm seeing Mary. But in any event, you don't need to see me.
I see you.
Okay, great. So we'll get started. And this title I actually came up with before I had all the details of what I was going to say. But I do think it's appropriate, and I do think it's somewhat descriptive of what I'd like to talk about today. So let me start by giving you a little bit of personal background. Mary did that as well. I've been researching and exploring the history of women religious for over 30 years. As she said, this was conducted in archives in over 4 dozen different congregations. I haven't really counted, but I've also read the histories of as many communities as I've been able to discover. And if I don't know your history, just tell me where I can find it, and I would love to know. My main research, frankly, focuses on the period prior to the 1917 Code of Canon Law. So most of my research has been on the period prior to 1917, but I do some research on the later period. And some of the examples that I'm going to be talking about today are from a slightly later period. The communities I visited are everywhere from New England to the Deep South, to California, to Texas, to the Midwest and the prairies. So I've tried to explore as broad a range of congregations. I only focus on active communities, apostolic communities, and not contemplatives, although there's some discussion of contemplatives in my own work. So that gives you a sense of what my focus is, where my expertise is, and where it's not. If you're interested in very recent contemplative life, probably not something I know a whole lot about. But this is what I've been doing. In many cases, I was the first, and to this date, still sometimes the only professional historian to visit particular repositories. So I was able to see them certainly before this organization existed, and when many congregations didn't have professional archivists or archivists who were trained at all. I was surprised in the 1980s that many of the archivists I met, and this actually was a great advantage to me, were former superior generals of their congregations who decided in their retirement that an appropriate ministry would be to organize and gather together, really, the archival materials in a systematic way. They had, many of them told me that during their terms in leadership, they had come to a greater appreciation of the importance of the congregation's history in guiding them in the present and in the future. And so that's what they chose to do. So it was really a privilege for me to work with many of these women. On the other hand, and some of you may think back on this and remember, sometimes the archives were kind of the lost orphan child of the community. And the people who were assigned to take care of them or to organize them really were not necessarily qualified to do so. And so the range of archivists I worked with in those 46 communities was extensive, from some extraordinarily well-qualified, knowledgeable, wise women to people who were doing it maybe as an overload because they were secretary of the congregation or because nobody could think of anything else to give them to do. I can only think of one or two of those. But the point is that I think one of the benefits of an organization like ACWR is that not only are professional archivists becoming involved in the organization and maintenance of sisters' records, but sisters themselves who are taking on this ministry are much better trained and much more grounded in what needs to be done. So I kind of did a lot of my research before that happened. When I'm not researching, I'm a professor of history, political science, religion, and women and gender studies at Syracuse. Obviously, I have a hard time making decisions. And almost all of my work is cross-listed between at least two of these departments or programs. I'm an associate, as Mary said, of the Monroe, Michigan IHMs. And I've also been an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow, which isn't relevant, but I had space on the slide, so I thought I'd put it down. Okay, so today's presentation is really going to be in 3 parts. And I hope that you'll find all of them interesting. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about general issues, comments, and suggestions regarding the future of women religious and their archives. And this is the more kind of professional development, professional brainstorming part of my presentation. The second part will be some stories and examples from my own research experience, which I hope will illustrate some of the challenges that are raised in the first part, and also some of the opportunities. And then finally, of course, questions and answers, which is the time for your voices and concerns, and for exploring some of the things I may mention in the first 2 parts that you'd like to know a little bit more about. And I should say that I expect I'll be doing more raising of questions than supplying of answers, especially in the first part of what I'm saying. But that should lead us to some good discussion, because I think we're at a point in the development and perpetuation of women's religious archives where those questions need to be asked, some of them difficult. And the answers are going to take us time to come up with, and we're not all going to come up with the same answers. And so what I hope to do today is to suggest some things you might want to be thinking about, rather than to say, this is what you ought to do, because that's not my place. And not all of you want or need to do the same things. Okay, so let's get started. seems to me we're at a really important turning point and a really important historical moment in which there are a lot of new challenges as well as opportunities for Sisters Archives. As institutional missions decrease, individual and house reports are less common or likely. When I was doing research on the 19th century, I found it incredibly interesting to read the reports from individual houses, individual missions in different congregations. This is where you really got a sense of what the sisters were doing, and for me, equally importantly, what their lives were like in the grassroots. Not just the official statements of leadership, but this is what's happening day to day to day at a parochial school, or among those nursing in a hospital, or taking care of orphans, or doing whatever it is that they're doing. So in today's world, where those kinds of reports are not as common, where more and more sisters are engaged in individual ministries, in many congregations are living in ones or twos, and sometimes in intercommunity housing, how do we get and preserve grassroots voices and experiences? And again, different congregations will answer that in different ways. But I would simply like to urge you to consider that maintaining and retaining those voices, preserving them, is an essential part of your history. And so it's something you need to be thinking about. With personnel changes, it also seems to me there are pluses and minuses. As I've already suggested, most people who are now archivists have more training, whether it's formal training in the sense of degrees or informal training in the sense of workshopping, mentoring with their predecessors in the ministry or whatever, and the resources of ACWR and other professional associations that help. And this is great, but maintaining that expertise and passing it on is increasingly important. There are also more archivists, including in my own community, the Monroe IHMs, who are not themselves sisters. They are, in fact, trained professional archivists. And what the responsibility, it seems to me, of the congregation is to both appreciate the professionalism and the expertise of these individuals, which is, after all, why they were hired, but also to make a really concerted effort to educate, inform, introduce them to the culture of the congregation and indeed the larger culture of religious life. When I first started doing this research, I had literally no background. My information on sisters was formed by two things. One was the musical The Sound of Music, which I saw on Broadway when I was a child, and Mary Martin played the world's oldest failed postulant. And, you know, the nuns undermined the Nazis, which was great. I thought they were wonderful and politically very shrewd, but I didn't really learn a lot. Nuns seemed to have really good voices, but after all, it was musical theater. The other thing was, for some reason, and I grew up in the South in a town that didn't have a lot of Catholics, somebody must have been interested in sisters, or somebody must have left these books to the library, but they had all the books about the Maryknoll sisters. And so there were books about In and Out of the Andes, and, you know, Mission in the Pacific, and Bernie Becomes a Nun, and all of these books were in our local public library. So for me, sisters were great adventurers. They were going to South America and Asia and Africa and doing all these remarkable things that nobody I knew was doing. So they were Nazi fighters, they were singers, they were adventurers. It's actually not all that inaccurate, but it's also not all that complete. So when I started I mean, there were no parochial schools in my town when I was growing up. And I really didn't meet any sisters until I was in graduate school. And so for me, the acculturation issue when I decided to do this research was a huge, huge challenge. I started reading, I wrote to every sisters organization I could find, you know, like they're now all religious as opposed to sisters, but I wrote to the Sisters Vocation Conference. I wrote to the Sister Formation Conference, and they sent me very generously a lot of their documentation and a lot of their newsletters and so forth. And I started reading them, and I felt like I was encountering a different culture. And I felt like I was an anthropologist. I had to learn a new language. I had to learn a new framework for understanding the world. And I'm not saying this in the way of criticism. I'm just saying it was a huge challenge. And we still see it today in those who attempt to write about or understand or present the world of Catholic sisters without knowing what they're talking about. This summer, a novel came out called Agatha of Little Neon, which is getting a lot of praise. And I've started reading it. I haven't finished it. But I knew I was in for a roller coaster ride when on page 1, the voice of the narrator, who is herself a sister of some 15 years at this point, refers to when she and her fellow sisters were novitiates instead of novices. Now, if that kind of mistake were being made in a book about sports or politics or any other field, it would be immediately corrected. But somehow with religious life, making mistakes like that is considered not a problem. So I had to learn this, and so did the sisters who work with the secular archivists who work with you. And that's the responsibility of the congregation, to provide that kind of, shall we dare call it, formation, certainly acculturation. And it may not be something that you've really thought a lot about, but it needs to be done. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges is that more and more of our materials are electronic. And how do we preserve and archive our tweets, our Instagram, our Facebook? How do we deal with email as a primary form of communication in many cases, as opposed to actual typed or handwritten letters? When a historian traditionally goes through archives, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with paper documents. Even if they've been scanned or microfilmed or digitized now, they started out as paper. But what do we do when it starts out as digital, as electronic, as almost intentionally ephemeral, which is the opposite of what archives are all about? And yet some of the most important historical primary materials of religious life today take that form. And how do archivists respond? And what kinds of resources are archivists being given to preserve things like tweets and emails and Instagrams and Facebook feeds and all of that for the future? Even Zoom recordings of community gatherings. Are you preserving those things? So it's a really important kind of change in the databases that we're all dealing with, and especially challenging, it seems to me, for archivists. And then finally, the consequences of closings. When I finish speaking today, I've been invited to go to the archival offices of the Franciscan Sisters of the Newman Communities, and I know one or more of their archival people are on this call or on this Zoom today, because they're moving their archives to a new facility, a smaller facility, but one near their now smaller residence in Syracuse. And they're generously giving me some books that they no longer need. And so I'm going over to pick up the books. But this is a really, really crucial time when a community is downsizing. And some of that's going to be inevitable, in part because communities themselves, in most cases, are downsizing. They're becoming smaller. Their membership is becoming smaller. And unlike a lot of people, I don't find that to be terribly worrisome or problematic, but it does mean that many people are selling big properties. Many people are maybe keeping their property, but using it in new and different ways. They're downsizing their archives, or they're deciding that either now or in the future, their archives will find a permanent home outside of the properties that are owned or operated by the congregation. So the consequences of these closings or these downsizings are what happens to the archives. And that's a huge question. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And we can come back to any of these other things. But let me suggest some questions that you might want to ask as you think about this closing and downsizing and future locations of things. Where should archival materials go? It seems to me that the most important considerations and questions concern context. And this may not be something you've thought about, or you may not have thought about it intentionally and specifically. How do you want to be understood? Not just now, but in the future. These are questions of framing. And these are really important questions for historians and for how your materials are going to be encountered and understood. The context in which people are going to intentionally and sometimes accidentally come across them. Now, it's one thing to say, if I want to know about the history of the Syracuse Franciscans or the Grand Rapids Dominicans or the Monroe IHMs or the Sisters of Mercy or whoever, that I go to their provincialate or their mother house, and there's an archive there, and I get in touch with the archivist and I say, can I do research there? And most of the time, I had a couple of people who said no, but most of the time I was told, yes, you're welcome to come. But in the future, maybe that's not going to be the principal way that people are going to find the archives of women religious. So how do you want to be understood? And one way of thinking about that is, who do you think your primary focus or audience will be, not just now, but in the future? These are not mutually exclusive categories, but they are somewhat different and will result in somewhat different answers. If you are thinking in terms of the congregation itself, perhaps the alumni of your institutions, the families of your congregation members, or the families you've traditionally ministered with, traditional supporters, then you may want to think about where your archives would be most accessible and most available to those audiences. Maybe you understand your history primarily in the context of local community or church. And this is particularly true if you've traditionally ministered within a particular geographic area, maybe a state, maybe a handful of states or a region, maybe even in some cases a city or a metropolitan area. In that case, maybe the diocesan archives would be a place where your materials would be most welcome, or a local county or state historical society, or a city historical society, if you're in a big enough city. Or do you want your history to be understood primarily by historians and other scholars, not all of whom are going to be Catholic? Do you see your future audience, your future clientele for archives, not for ministry, but for archives, as being, for example, people who do American social history, or if you're part of an international community, international history? Do you see it as being most at home in the history of medicine, if you've primarily focused on healthcare, history of education? I have, as of now, about 8 bookcases of books on the history of sisters. That doesn't count what's on my Kindle. And I had to make a decision when I was updating my will a few years ago as to where those books might go. Hopefully not for a while, but at some point when I'm no longer around to take care of them and provide them with a nice little home in my basement study. And I made the decision that I was going to donate my books, not to a Catholic library, but to my alma mater, Smith College, which is a women's college, because I want the history of sisters to be increasingly understood, identified, and appreciated within the context of the history of American women. And almost all my books are American, so that's why. So I decided that I could donate my books to a Catholic repository or a Catholic university. There's a Catholic college in the city of Syracuse, Lemoyne College. I could have given them there. But I decided instead that I wanted these books to go to a secular women's college. And what better than my alma mater? The special collections librarian has already been to my home, has seen my collection, was kind of overwhelmed, but ecstatic to be getting them someday. And the books will not be named, the collection will not be named after me, because it's not about me. Instead, it's going to be, I've already told them the name, and I've told them they have to make nameplates. And it will be the Molly Rogers collection on the history of women religious. And for those of you who don't know, Molly Rogers, or Mother Mary Josephine Rogers, Joseph Rogers, her real name was Mary Josephine Rogers, was the founder of the Maryknoll Sisters, and also was an alumna of Smith College. So I want the collection to be named after her. And that, I think, will reinforce the point of the connection between this secular college and the history of women religious. So I think these are the kinds of questions you need to be thinking about. Who your audience is, what context you want your materials to be preserved in, and where you'd like them to go. In some cases, you may want to start getting there now and send some of the materials now and then continue to do so. But you probably at some point before it becomes a critical decision, my gosh, we're selling the property in 6 months, we got to decide what to do. That's not the time to make these decisions. You should start thinking about it now when it's not particularly urgent. And in that case, I would say archivists play a role, but not the only role in making this decision. These are congregational decisions. And archivists are an essential part of the decision-making process because you know, A, what you've got, B, what's required in the way of preservation and so forth. But this is a decision at least for leadership and perhaps for the community as a whole. And that, of course, will depend on how your decision-making processes work. But the who is bigger than the archives, although the archives have to be part of that. The second question is, what is significant? What gets saved and why? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And that's through some of the stories I want to tell. Some of the most interesting stuff that enlightened me most clearly and explicitly about what was important in coming to understand what religious life is really all about, as somebody who's never been a sister, were things that might not have been preserved except out of luck. And sometimes the communities themselves didn't even know what they had. So let me tell you some stories. This is the fun part of my talk, I hope. My first story has to do with the Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon and Mother Wilhelmina Bliley. Now, I don't know if there are any Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon on the Zoom today. If so, I'm going to give a very, very truncated version of your history. The sisters celebrated their centennial in 1986, which means they were formally founded in 1886. And that, ironically, was exactly when I was in Oregon. I was actually there in 1985. And I met Father Wilfred Schoenberg, who was a Jesuit professor at Gonzaga University, who wrote their history. And he told me that for many years, the history had been kind of obscured and kind of hidden. And even many of the sisters didn't know the true story of their history, which was kind of a challenge. They were, for a time, some of their early sisters were part of a schismatic group that had broken away from the Sisters of the Precious Blood in Ohio. They had been excommunicated, although the sisters didn't know that. The woman here that you see is their first superior, Mother Wilhelmina, who joined the community and the schismatic group, although she didn't know it was schismatic, she probably didn't know what that was, when she was 8 years old. They left Ohio, went to Wisconsin, went then to Minnesota. No, they went from Ohio to Wisconsin to Minnesota, where the founding priest, who was sort of their guru, died. And then they ended up in Oregon. This journey took about 20 years. They were finally rescued by the Archbishop of Portland, or Oregon City at the time. In the course of all this, Mother Wilhelmina was deposed. The name of the community was changed from Sisters of the Precious Blood to Sisters of St. Mary. Their habit was changed. And if you look at early accounts of their history, it has none of this information I've just told you. In the course of renovating and moving the mother house, the diary of Emma Bliley, later Mother Wilhelmina, was discovered. And that's where a lot of this detail came from. What if it had never been discovered? They were kind of embarrassed by a lot of their story. I mean, they were part of a schismatic group. So all I'm saying is, this is an example of material that might have been lost permanently, but fortunately they found her diary. and they decided it was important to understand the truth of their history. And it's an extraordinary story. I urge you to read the book, Those Valiant Women by Wilfred Schoenberg, which tells you the story of the Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon. And he's also got a terrific sense of humor as he tells the story. In other cases, communities may decide that there are things they just don't want people to see because it's now embarrassing. I had a really interesting experience when I went to do research in the archives of the Amityville Dominicans, one of the first Dominican communities in the United States, certainly one of the first that came from Europe. And their archivist was one of those women who had been superior, president, prioress of the congregation before she moved to archives. And I was there for a few days doing research in their archives. And she came up to me and she said, I have to show you this entry in sort of the house diary, the Chronicles of the Mother House. This was from a circular letter that had been sent by one of their early 20th century prioresses to all the houses of the congregation. This was not something that was filed with all the other stuff at the time, although I think she put it in the regular files after she showed it to me. She said, you need to know that this was a part of our history. And this is what it said. It was an account of Mother Mary Catherine, who was the prioress from 1901 to 1907, about the purchase of land for what became St. Rose Industrial School for Girls and a girls' orphanage. There's a picture of St. Rose. She wrote, fearing to have Hebrews for our neighbors, we purchased through the kindness of Reverend Father Gerard the adjoining 24 acres for the sum of $8,300, and of which a balance of $5,400 are to be paid off. Thus, we are secured for all times, secured from not having Hebrews as their neighbors. This is on Long Island, New York. It would be very easy to just kind of, as you're downsizing or moving or refiling for this, somehow to get lost. But I'll tell you what I learned about that was the tremendous trust of that archivist to show this to me, and the tremendous responsibility it put on me as a historian to be worthy of her trust. But I learned so much, not only about where the community's collective head was at in 1907 or whatever year this was. The orphanage opened in 1906. But where the community's head was at the time it was shown to me, which was very, very different. Here's another understanding of race from another Dominican community, that of Mary Knoll. And on the left, we see a picture of Mother Mary Joseph. And over here, we see a picture of the second mission band that was sent to China. Pay particular attention to the third woman from the left. This was in the account of the house diary that was kept in the early days. They weren't even Mary Knoll sisters yet. They weren't even sisters yet in 1914, because the community was officially founded in 1920. In the house diary, it was recorded, today, Mary Louise, Mary Augustine, and Sarah were called separately to Mother's room and asked to give their votes in regard to the admission of a candidate who had Negro blood. Father and Mary Joseph were both well impressed with the girl and admired the spirit in which she frankly stated her case and said she would not wish to be cut off from her stepfather and her little sister, who were Black. Under the circumstances, Father Superior and Mother thought that the oldest ones here should be consulted to make sure she would be welcome. And we were asked to enclose our vote in an envelope and hand it to Father. 6 weeks later, there was a note in the archives of the arrival of the new postulant, Elsie Davis. And later a report that she was sent to work on subscription cards to the Maryknoll magazine, which she seemed to enjoy. She is young and cheery, quote, with some suggestion of her colored blood in her features. She was the 14th person to enter the congregation. She became Sister Mary Frances. She's the third woman here on the left and was a member of the second mission band to go to China. And she lived and was active in ministry in China and then elsewhere until she died in 1966. At a conference a few years ago, I mentioned this incident in a Q&A. The Maryknoll archivist at the time was there and said, "Oh no, we never had Black sisters at that time." And I said, "Yes, you did." She didn't know what she had. I was really impressed by the openness of the community at a time when the Ku Klux Klan was being refounded in the United States. This was the era of birth of a nation. And the Maryknoll sisters accepted a woman of color, and not only accepted her, but she was clearly an important and valued member of the congregation, such that she was part of the second mission band to go to China. A tremendous responsibility and a tremendous honor. I'm so glad that was saved. Okay, this is one of my favorite stories, and it's a favorite story both for its content, which I'll share with you in a minute, and also because of how it was found. When I was doing research at the archives of the Dubuque Franciscans, they then had a community, a heritage room, which they no longer have, I discovered on the phone about 2 weeks ago. And the archivist decided that over lunch one day, she would go and make sure it was dusted because it wasn't open on a regular basis so that she could show it to me. And when I came back from lunch, she excitedly showed me a manila envelope that had been found stuck behind something in the heritage room. It wasn't even in the archives. And she said, "I don't know what this is, but the label on it says results of 1921 survey." And it turned out the community was revising its constitutions and its customary in response to the codification of canon law in 1917. Ironically, when I was at Dubuque in the mid-1980s, they were revising their constitutions and so forth in response to the 1984 Code of Canon Law. And they didn't know the survey had been conducted 35 years earlier. We didn't find a copy of the survey itself, but we found all the answers, and most of them were from individual houses. And I learned so much from those results. I learned what was important at the grassroots level to these sisters. Many of their responses called for really practical things, such as allowance for more changes of underwear, for we could not find time to do laundry every week. A softer veil, quote, "The stiff ones prevent close observation of pupils in school and in church. They are a menace to safety on the street, what with automobiles. And our headdress is the cause of many headaches, earaches, and eye trouble, also tonsil trouble." Another comment, "Cannot sisters be excused from wearing face veils and mantles on the street in summer?" and more time to dress in the morning. Cannot, sister, where is this? More time to dress in the morning. Just consider the fact that 22 sisters have use of only one toilet, and everyone cannot have her own alarm clock. Permission to talk at meals, noting, in fact, that we don't keep quiet anyway at our house. An elimination of table reading, permission to eat with relatives, to stay at their parents' residence, and to offer hospitality to their fathers and brothers, implying that they were already doing so for their mothers and sisters. In summarizing her reaction to the old ways, one of these Iowa women said, "Where is charity in our customs?" What I found remarkable was that they saved all these responses. Sisters felt free enough and comfortable enough to express themselves. I could not find a picture of Sister Egidia. This is the habit the community wore in 1921. This is the habit they were wearing when she entered. And I thank Sister Maxine, the current archivist, who sent these to me last week. This is the letter. Sister Egidia did not think that she would be fully represented by the report from her local convent, so she decided to write her own response. This was one of the most remarkable documents I found in my research. After circulars were sent, Sister Fernanda with Cortona, Leocadia, etc. sent their remarks, but the oldest sisters here knew nothing about it, hence a separate paper from me. Remarks. Number 1, an hour meditation is too long, especially for mission sisters. 2, change of veil for soft black veil. 3, collars without starch and no bands. 4, sisters should not remain so long in one mission, and when term expires should not be left there to make trouble, and after 3 years ascend throne again. Nor should her successor be called a substitute, as Ex Colette said. Ex Colette is former Superior Mother Colette, who is pictured here. She calls her Ex Colette through this whole letter. There is something wrong in our elections. You know as well as I do, and I think you have formerly also complained, that some few domineer the elections by their influence. Some of our delegates have not even finished 4th grade, and they should discuss the business matters of the community. I know some of these older ones like stupid delegates, that they can more easily influence them. Something is wrong about it. I think canon law was made for large communities who have not got such small missions and such ignorant people as delegates. I don't mean people who have not a great education, but I mean those who have common sense and stability of character. She goes on and on and on, and I won't read the whole letter, but it's very hard to read some of this without laughing. And finally, she says, I am also opposed to what I might call an autocratic circle. Those in office shove each other from one office to another and keep the circle going. This creates an autocratic rule and makes life continually hard for those whom they dislike. The Archbishop said some rulers are detrimental spiritually and financially, and still we have the same old regime under another name. P.S. I think canon law requires all members of the community to be familiar with canon law. We have some old books that are useless now, but not one that fully explains canon law. Why have we not the opportunity to read and learn canon law from a complete book and not a condensed form? I read this with the archivist at the time, who was herself not a young woman, and who remembered Sister Egidia, who died in 1938. And she had known Egidia when she was a novice, and Egidia was in the nursing wing. And she had helped take care of Sister Egidia. And she said, this explains a lot. But what it explained to me was not the comments of a cranky old woman, but some other things. Here's a woman who might have been cranky and who might have had some complaints, But she was faithful. She remained in the community. She did her job, and she felt free to speak, and her comments and her feedback were saved along with that of everybody else in the congregation. I probably learned as much about the day-to-day living of religious life from that one document as I did from any other single document that I encountered in all of my research. And what I did not learn was crankiness. What I learned was fidelity and trust. And that's the lesson. But a letter like this could easily have been discarded or discounted. I have one more anecdote to share with you. And this comes from the kind of traditional source that may not any longer exist, or not exist in the same form that it existed before. And that's in the form of circular letters from prioresses and superiors to the local houses. This is a letter from Mother Alphonse, who is here on the right, to the local houses of her community, one of which is pictured in this postcard. The woman who is seated is the lay sister. This is from the School Sisters of St. Francis of Wisconsin. And this letter was written in 1922. A number of abuses, which may not in any way be tolerated, have crept into the community. Sisters walk around in the house, sit around, and study in their kimonos. In the strictest way, I forbid all sisters to wear their kimonos anywhere except in their bedrooms. Another serious irregularity is that sisters now use powder, rouge, cosmetics, and lipstick. For God's sake, how will worldly minded sisters go? Truly, I fear for such sisters. If sisters will not overcome temptations to vanity in this life, how will they overcome the temptation of the devil at the hour of death? With all the power of my office, I forbid every sister without exception to use rouge to color eyebrows, lips, or cheeks. I would never believe that such a command would ever have to be given, but unfortunately that is the case today. That is the spirit of the world. Woe to the religious who falls victim to this spirit. Another irregularity is that sisters are beginning to cut off the strings from the forehead band and pinning them together with safety pins or sewing them together. This too I forbid in the strictest possible way. What won't the sisters try next? So for those who hear complaints about how religious life ain't what it used to be, and why can't we go back to the good old days when sisters were sisters and knew how to behave, I think about this letter, which was written not to one house that might have been a little wacky, but to the entire congregation, which means this behavior was pretty widespread in 1922. What will the sisters try next? I learned so much from documents that might not have been saved, or that might not be saved in the future because they're either embarrassing, or they seem trivial, or they seem, problematic in one way, or just not very important. So I urge you, as you do the kind of decision-making that inevitably will happen, as you move your archives, as you decide the context in which it's going to be understood, your history, as you decide what to keep and what not to keep, that you think about stories like this in your own history and in your own experience, and you appreciate the value of the unexpected, the value of the serendipitous, the value of the human in it all. That's what an archive at its best is able to preserve and to convey to all of those earlier audiences that I suggested might be your audience and your context. but especially for audiences that you can't even imagine today might be those who will want to know about you in the future. So I thank you very much, and I want to open it up to questions and answers. If you want to either use the hand raise function or put something in the chat, that would be great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now, just so I can see what's in the chat. And that is not her in the picture. Who is not who in what picture? Will Ellen Pierce please speak?
So she's not in the third band, which is the photo, and that's not her.
That was the third band. That
Yes.
was not the second band. I'm sorry.
Right.
That's my mistake, Ellen. It's good to see you.
Hi.
Hi, we met. You were the archivist who said we didn't have a Black sister. Exactly.
And I wanted to clarify that. I thank you for bringing that up when you did to me.
Oh, you acknowledged it. I mean, you were great.
Oh yeah, well, we knew of one, but we never knew about the first one. So when we went back to look, what we found fascinating was, first of all, she was number 13, not number 14.
Okay, thank you.
Which I always thought fascinating that she was number 13.
Okay, I had number 14 somehow, but I will correct it.
She actually was, when she came back from China, which was, as you said, a very, that was a great job. I mean, that was wonderful that they sent her off. She wound up being the treasurer of the congregation for the rest of her life.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
They really embraced her. I think the reason that Mother Mary Joseph asked these women who were just secretaries at the time.
Right.
I think, they were all from Boston. They were white women, some of them educated and so on.
Right.
And I think, you're asking somebody to be in your dorm room for a while,
Exactly.
sleep in a little house, an old rickety house. And I think she kind of needed to, kind of ease her in or ask them permission. And I think that kind of gets lost in the translation when you read that she wanted their permission to have her join them.
I got the very clear sense that she wanted Elsie to be comfortable and the other women to be comfortable.
Right.
I really thought of it as a very human and humane decision of Molly Rogers, of Mary Joseph.
We also, whenever we have a tour of the archives with the rest of the sisters, and I can tell you this anecdotally, that all of the archive staff know about it at this point. They know who the first one was. And so one of them was quizzed by another Black sister during one of our tours, and she said, well, tell me, who do you think was the first Black sister? Well, it was a trick question, and she knew the right answer. She said Elsie Davis, right, so fast that the woman just about dropped. So the sisters, so it sort of reaffirmed that the archives knew what they were talking about at that point. But I thank you for, pointing it out to me. I was not the archivist when you came.
No, you weren't.
I wasn't there.
And so I really appreciate both the correspondence that we had later where you said, yes, thank you. And, I mean, you were great. I think it's interesting that the community didn't even know in some ways. I mean, some in the community did.
Some of them knew, yeah.
The archives didn't. So it's part of the acculturation too of archivists who are not sisters.
Yeah. I also had a question. I don't want to take up too much time, but I mean, I know you're coming at this from a researcher's point of view. So that does make things a little different for people who are talking about where things should go and why. And when you said, who is your user of your archives? Who wants to know about you?
Yeah.
And you suggested a few groups. I think it also makes you kind of look back and see who's using it now. I mean, who's your audience now? And is that going to be your audience in the future?
I think that's true. And let me just add to that some of you are really, your history deserves a bigger and more expansive audience than you already have. And so, yes, keep with the audience you got, but think about ways in which you might want to expand your audience too in the future. People who don't know about your history and what you have in the way of resources. And let me give you an example of that. I remember a number of years ago, there was a book on the history of hospitals in New York City. Not a single Catholic hospital was included, and not a single hospital run by sisters was included. I mean, what that means is this is a selective and clearly incomplete history of hospitals in New York City. And so people need to know that those resources exist and are accessible, and that their work is embarrassingly incomplete if they don't think about what sisters have to say to them. So yes, definitely think about who's using your archives now, but think about who might benefit from using them in the future. And making sure that people know the kinds of resources you have. Make your finding aids available. Maybe the finding aid online, no matter where your things go, and so forth. I see there are a couple of hands up, and there are some questions in the chat. And by the way, Ellen, if you can send me a picture of the second mission band, you will earn my undying gratitude.
I would if I could, but I'm retired.
Oh, well,
you can contact the archives. So
I think I will. Thank you. So Lisa Gibbon, you have your hand up electronically. Why don't we go to you, and then we'll go back to the chat box.
Hi, Peggy. I'm Lisa Gibbon. I'm the director of the archives for the Congregation of St. Joseph here in Cleveland.
Oh, yes.
Ohio. And we are a consolidated archives, charism-based, 7 communities that came together to create the congregation in 2007. And so we brought all of the archives. We have one more to pull under our roof. So I have so much to say, but I'm just gonna here's my basic points. What you just said about who our researchers are now and who they can be in the future. So let me address that first. The majority of our researchers now, which is our bread and butter, I have to admit, are our genealogists, right? That's our bread and butter, because they are going to get connected back to the congregation, back to the sisters, maybe if they've lost it, if they're alumni, etc. And that nostalgia factor is going to increase their connection to the development department, get the money back, so we can get the money back out to the missions that the sisters are up to. So that's kind of, not all archives, academic archives, for example, value genealogists as much as we do. So it's really, really important.
I know that I do know.
And / alumni. So that's really important to us. However, those are our biggest users now, but those are also the easiest users to take care of electronically. It doesn't matter where we are. They don't need to be geographically close to our archives to have their needs met. They just need to find us. So that's my job, is to make sure that they can find us, to get their needs met, and then everything can happen electronically. I think that the greater value of our archives lies in academic research about the role of the sisters during the 60s, the impact of Vatican II,
exactly.
Racism, integral.
Ellen Trajan is a member of one of your congregations, for example, and so her papers will be really valuable.
They were donated before I began in the archives. They were sent someplace else because we didn't have a professional plan in place. So
maybe they could be digitized and shared.
Yep. They're mostly about her making of her film, though. They're at DePaul. So they're at DePaul, and that's great. And also, we also lost, before I started working, the papers of Chris Shank's Future Church. They all went to the Loyola Women's Archives in Chicago. But again, that's okay. That's okay. I have the finding aids, and I know where they are. So okay, so I think in the future, we've got much hard-hitting researchers that we can appeal to and bring in, especially around our model of consolidation and reconfiguration of the sisters themselves and how they chose to deal with it. So then my job then as a professional archivist coming in, and I'm the first professional archivist that they've hired, is to figure out how to get that out there. So I've got my 100-year backlog, right? My 100-year, 2,000-foot backlog. Plus I've got, so I need to create finding aids and get them out there to the researchers. So that's really where I see my job as being. When you mentioned, you had context, what's the context of the archives, and you had 3 different things underneath there. Let's see, local communities, historians, and congregational members and families. I think like, I really thought that you kind of, you missed out by not mentioning this charism-based coming together.
I agree with you there. I agree with you there that certainly we're seeing more and more of that kind of collaborative effort. And that is a way, we've seen it with the Sisters of Mercy and we've seen it with some groups of Dominicans.
Right.
The Franciscans of the Newman communities are an example.
Right. So even though it's removed perhaps from its original geographic context, the purpose, the connection is all in one place. And so a researcher could come to us to work on the history of the sisters in education, or the history of the sisters prison ministry, and they get a whole bunch of different perspectives, but from the same charism base. So when I am faced with explaining this to leadership or non-archivists about why it's okay to bring things under one roof in one place that's geographically removed, I remind them about technology and how much researchers depend upon technology today anyway, so that it's okay. But I wanted to follow up, and then I'll be quiet, or almost quiet. How about that? I think of one more thing after this. I can see Joanne laughing at me. When I was working with our records in Kalamazoo, and I talk about this a lot, so a lot of the people here know this already, that we made an active decision based upon our mission statement that we were not going to document alumni or student life from the colleges and schools. And because the Alumni Association in Kalamazoo is so strong and so connected back to its roots there of the community, we transferred all of those items. We deaccessioned them to the Western Michigan University Zhang collection. And I don't think that was a wrong thing to do. And I think that was a difficult decision, but it's respectful of the local alumni's needs to know what's going on.
As long as you can get that, know where they are, and you can direct people to. So it's not an all or nothing. It's not an all or nothing. No, it's not. And I think the kind of decisions that you've made in the context of this consolidated congregations and archives are going to be really increasingly important as more and more of those kinds of collaborative efforts take place. And some of them already are.
They are.
And so I think that's a really important point. I wanted to address a couple of I want to make sure we have enough time.
We have about 15 minutes and 2 people in chat.
Okay, let me make sure I get to them, and then I'll come back to you if we have time, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thanks. Because I think you raised some really important points. So Scott Kiefer says, and there's another question. Yes, I have been to the Sisters of St. Joseph in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but I've also been to the archives in Albany and in St. Louis. So the answer that I got to that question in the chat. Archives sometimes have our speculation on what will be of interest in the future. Well, I think, again, sisters need to be expansive in their understanding and appreciation, and maybe overcome a little of their traditional modesty and humility. and I don't mean humiliation, I mean humility, which is a good thing, about who is interested. When I would go around and do research in these archives, the question I was always asked was, are you a sister, or are you a former sister? Or sometimes if I'd say, then I'd say no, and they say, well, why are you even interested in our history? And there was this sense of almost disbelief that anybody outside of the congregation or outside of the church would really care. And I think they need to make they need to make their materials accessible to and make awareness of what they have accessible to people. So what kinds of materials or topics do I, as a historian, envision being a part of historical interest? And the answer is almost anything can be. Almost anything can be, because historians are going to focus on different things. If I'm writing a history of parochial schools or a history of higher education, I'm going to be looking for certain things in his sister's archives. But if I'm interested in women's contribution to the Americanization of immigrants, I'm going to be looking at a whole bunch of other stuff, including perhaps the education. So I would hate to limit the future utility of archives by saying nobody's going to care about this. We don't need to save that. So to save as much as possible and to frame your resources in as broad and as welcoming a way as you can. And this goes to a question that Casey has said. As we move our archives in the future, we need to have allied professionals on our side. What about the state of women's religious studies? How can women religious historians leverage their influence? I think that's a really good question, and clearly we need to work together between the History of Women Religious Conference and also the HRIBI in Ireland and Britain and other organizations, the American Catholic Historical Association and others. But again, even among historians, and I was a founding member of the Conference on the History of Women Religious, so I've been involved in it since its beginnings. And even the members there don't all agree on what they're doing and the context of their work. I do not consider myself a church historian. I consider myself a women's historian. And I consider my primary audience not to be a Catholic one. And that's not true of everybody who's writing the history of sisters. And I'm not saying I made the right decision and they're wrong. I'm saying I made a different decision and so did they. And so when you ask about how do we work together, I think we do have a difference. You know, we have to realize, just as archives aren't all the same, historians aren't all the same. And so again, the breadth question becomes really important. I think the History of Women Religious Conference is a good thing, but I personally hope that more and more of the research will not be confined. And I use that word deliberately and somewhat sadly, because I think the work that people doing the History of Women Religious is doing is of interest to far more than those who do the history of church or the history of sisters. And so I'd like to see more sessions at secular historical conferences, secular women's studies conferences, secular, theological conferences, and so forth, that have a focus and a concentration on the history and the contributions of sisters, and not just within the context of people talking to each other who already know that this is important, who already know about the significance. And yes, they're learning more about more communities and going into more depth. But I want this to reach my colleagues who have absolutely no idea absolutely no idea of what we all do and what we all deal with. And so that's what I view my mission as being. It's not the mission of everybody, and it shouldn't be, but it is an important one. And I think it's going to be an increasingly important one among secular scholars. And yes, I mean, I try to be informed on church history and theology and all of those things, spirituality, charism, all of those things. But I want your stories to be part of the mainstream of history, not some kind of sidebar stuff. And that's where I'm going. And I would like for more people who it hasn't even occurred to them that they should be looking at the history of sisters or the archives of women religious, to think about doing that as they write about whatever it is they're writing about. And some of you are opening up your archives in ways that are fantastic. I just want to see more of that. And that's very selfish of me, I know, but it's very important. Couple of other comments. I've read Sister Janet Farnham's history already. She's a friend of mine. So I say that to Doris. Had I known that I could get a copy this way, I would have waited, but it's really an excellent history. Yes, and we've corresponded about it. Lisa says the story about, yes, I think you're right. The education of historians, and I worked on the history of the IHMs in Monroe with them. It was done as a collaborative effort by a group of scholars, not all of whom were historians. And they wrote their sesquicentennial history, and it is a collection of essays rather than a narrative history, which is one approach. And when we got to the question of audience, the question was, should we look to Catholic publishers or not? And they very intentionally looked at secular publishers. And we're fortunate enough, Syracuse University Press had a series on the history of religion, and it was accepted into that series because they wanted their history to be understood as part of the larger history of the role of women in religion, not the role of nuns in this kind of compartmentalized Catholic world. They knew it would get understood there already, but they wanted to frame it in a way that would also reach people who might not otherwise be aware of what sisters have done and of what sisters are doing and of the resources that their archives offer to scholars from a variety of disciplines and a variety of approaches. It was also, I just want to make another point, which is that one of the things that I came to really appreciate by doing archival work in as many places as I did and reading as broadly as I did in the histories of communities I was not able to visit, is to realize the tremendous diversity of religious life. That if I'm trying to write a general history of sisters in the 19th and early 20th century, it's really a challenge because the sisters didn't fit a mold and don't fit a mold today, and that's wonderful. I want to convey that sisters are an incredibly diverse and complex group of human beings. There's not some little plaster statue that represents the nun or something, but that religious life has always expressed itself in different ways, not only in terms of charism and spirituality, but in terms of lifestyle. Even in the 19th century, it was so diverse, how people live their day-to-day life. It's really a fascinating story, and it cannot be dismissed. The complexity cannot be dismissed. So the more archives that are available, the more the complexity of that story. Where are historians going that we can put ourselves out there? Again, I think part of what you can do is make sure your finding aids are available broadly. when you've got, make sure that your websites are accessible. Make sure you have interconnections with secular archivists and historical organizations, both in your locale and if you're a community that's always focused primarily on education, historians of education. If you're a community that's focused largely on healthcare, then historians of medicine. These are the kinds of connections you can make. And let local universities know that your archives are available for graduate students to do primary research, to maybe write a master's or doctoral dissertation, this kind of thing. But be prepared, they're not going to have a clue about nuns, and you're going to have to educate them about that, as well as just assume they can make a deep dive into your materials and know what to do with them.
So Peggy, I hate to interrupt, but I think our time is coming to an end. A couple things. One is we must have your contact information.
Yes, let me
on
put
your
that
last
back on
slide,
the
please.
screen.
Some
Let me
people
put
are
that back,
asking.
and you are more than welcome to contact me individually.
Okay.
Let me go back.
I also just want to thank you for packaging for us in a concise way the major challenges that we're facing, and for, again, helping us. Again, it's kind of like you packaged up the provocative questions that we need to be considering. And obviously you've launched us into the questions and the discussions and the conversations, which I think will be coming forth in the rest of the Thursdays. And starting with a week from today, when we have a panel discussion on the collaborative archive initiatives and opportunities. So I can't think of anyone that could have done this better. And if you could hear the applause,
oh, thank you.
It would be a standing ovation.
Well, can I just say something? If you have a recent history, do not assume you have to send me a free copy, but please email me and say, do you have a copy of our history? Because it may be like the Religious of Jesus and Mary that I've already read it, but so I don't want you to send me another copy, but I would be happy to purchase or receive any of your histories. And so, you know, this is a selfish request, but I do not expect to get them free of charge. And I'm really grateful to all of you for all of the work that you do, because it's so important. And I literally would not have a career without you.
Well, on behalf of all the members and the board of the ACWR, we thank you. And I want to remind everyone that in about a half an hour, we'll have a social. Bring your own whatever, your liquids. And we look forward to seeing everyone again and seeing you next week. And take a rest, because Zoom is so intense. We're all exhausted.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Peggy. We'll be
Bye-bye.
seeing you. Bye-bye.